Hi, welcome back. This is Joel Duff from thenaturalhistorian.com, and today I'm going to talk a little botany plus a little hyperspeciation or hyperevolution, creationism, baraminology, and get into a little bit of the taxonomy of cotton and its relatives. Right. So what got me thinking about this? Well, I saw a tweet from Answers in Genesis in which they shared an old article about cotton. And I had seen it before, and I often thought, I want to talk about that at some point. It kind of helps. It's kind of a way for me to talk about plants and then pull in a lot of things that I've talked about in the past with respect to a variety of criticisms of Answers in Genesis approach to understanding origins of especially plants. And so this cotton thing gave me a chance to talk about that. And so let's get right to it. All right, let's start with a picture of cotton. Now, I know everyone probably knows what cotton looks like and what cotton is used for. And you know that it is grown in voluminous amounts, but maybe you've never seen the pictures of flowers of cotton. Now, this isn't the typical cotton plant species that most cotton is derived from, but I think you can see that this particular flower belongs to a plant that produces this type of fruit, and that's what cotton is. Cotton is a fruit. It is a cellulose production. Cellulose is paper, but in very, very thin fibers. And that's the fruit that's produced by this particular flower. And this flower, I'm going to be talking about this flower and comparing it to other flowers. So here's where the little bit of botany lesson comes in. We have a very interesting structure to the flower. So you've got your petals out here, but in here you've got all these little yellow blobs. Those are the anthers, or the male parts that are producing the pollen. And this thing sticking out the end here is the stigma, which is attached to various styles that run down into the gynecium, or the female ovary at the base, or in this case, probably multiple ovaries. And what's interesting is you have this, I'm trying to avoid the technical terms here, partly because I can't remember them. But you have these fused anthers in a tube that then the female part runs down inside of. Now, that's a very interesting and unique feature. Now, I don't mean unique to cotton, though. It's actually found in a variety of other similar plants, which taxonomists, such as myself, would group into a family of organisms. This particular version of this fused tube is found mostly within one group within that particular family. This family is called the Malvaceae, or the mallow family, and you may be familiar with a plant like this, which is hibiscus, common cultivar, and you'll see that it has the same sort of structure. I took these two pictures just 45 minutes ago. I was coming into the building to give this talk, to do this talk that I had prepared, and I turned my head and I said, well, there's a couple members of the Malvaceae right there. Recognized them right away. And I went over, took a couple pictures. I love this particular picture because I didn't quite get the whole thing here, but this is the College of Engineering. And engineers have a particular idea of what it means to be designed, right? And the article we're going to look at talks about God having designed this particular plant for human beings, right? God designed Gossypium. Gossypium is the genus which all the different species of cotton are in. And so there are multiple species of cotton. That's going to be important to our story as well. This is Gossypium darwinii, which, surprise, surprise, is only found on the Galapagos Islands. And this is not the version of cotton that anyone has cultivated, even though it produces a fruit that looks cultivatable. There are other ones that produce more fruit than that. Anyway, this is hibiscus, and I hope you see the similarity in structure. It has this crazy tube of anthers that are fused together around the female parts. This plant does not produce cotton, but it does produce a fruit, which is quite similar to cotton overall in its structure. And then it has these bracts, it has these sepals, and the sepals, instead of turning brown and really hard, covering the fruits, this one turns more papery. And the hard ones are formed in cotton, and inside they produce seeds, I'm sorry, little fruits inside. And those fruits do have sort of a cottony texture inside, but they're all compact. And the way they're distributed is they don't open up and then float away. All right, which is what cotton does. All right, so here's the article from Answers in Genesis. Actually, this is the tweet that I saw that inspired me to talk about this. And you'll notice here in the tweet what the wording is, and this is why I wanted to talk about it. What does it mean exactly? What is Answers in Genesis trying to say? And how I think this is a very much an oversimplification of these terms. And so that's what we want to talk about here. God clearly had people in mind when he designed this lowly plant. All right. So when God designed, so first of all, what does it mean to be designed? How does God design things? And then also, when did he design this particular plant? Is this a process that continues over time? Does design mean some sort of continuous process of sculpting? Is it immediately created? All right, just like instantaneous creation, and it has all these design characteristics that are then made for man. Those are the things that we want to explore just a little bit farther here. So if you click on that particular link, I want to show you that here are these bracts that are very similar to the hibiscus, except in this case, they turn very hard and they end up holding that fruit, right? That's, again, the fruit are these fibers that are produced. And those fibers then eventually, some of them are attached to a seed, right? And what's the purpose of the flower? The flower's purpose is to be able to create the next generation of organisms, right? The next generation of cotton. And it also wants to have some ability to disperse its offspring, right, to other places. And the way that does that in this particular case is it produces this fibrous bundle we call cotton, which then when it ripens or starts to dry, will expand. And as it expands, it cracks and opens this structure. And then the wind can help this cotton float away. And as it floats away, it brings the seed with it. Now, you might be thinking, God, I mean, that cotton is like so heavy and thick, right? Isn't cotton, I mean, I know it's fairly light, but still, it's a big bunch. Does it really float away? Well, you know, this is cotton that we have manipulated for a long period of time to develop a large amount of cotton within one single follicle in this fruit. And generally, it won't float away as easily. Some cotton does float away in fields, you'll see, but it's nothing like sort of the native cotton would have. Of course, the native cotton doesn't produce as much cotton. So anyway, I've been saying, what's the purpose of cotton? Well, from the perspective of that particular plant, it serves a specific purpose. That specific purpose is to help it disperse the seed, right? It's making that cotton to help disperse the seed so it can make more cotton plants somewhere else rather than competing and all just falling at the base of the same plant. So John Upchurch, who wrote this article, he is the editor of Jesus.org, and he's contributed a lot of articles to this website. Now, I'm calling this a fluff piece for Answers in Genesis, and a lot of his writings are. And by fluff piece, play on words here for cotton. But you know what a fluff piece is, right? It doesn't really contain a whole lot of information, all right? It's very simple. And I think this is oversimplified. And that's part of my criticism, is that they're using what are really important terms, but in such a common way that you can interpret them kind of any way you want, right? So like, I can't get in trouble. It's just like, God did it, right? This is really wonderful. That's amazing. God did it. And there's a place for that. But I think it still gives me an opportunity to talk about these ideas of design and talk about hyperspeciation. And so like when you dig a couple layers below, you start to think, I don't think they've really thought about this very much, right? I don't think they think about what they're saying and what they mean and what they think they're saying, right? Oh, so he has a Bachelor's of Arts in English from the University of Tennessee. Go Vols. I'm an actual graduate of the University of Tennessee as well, though I got my PhD in botany there. So great, talking about plants. He said, "Yeah, you can't cook them, you can't eat them. So why are there so many of these little fluffy white balls made?" Well, God clearly had people in mind when He designed this lowly plant with so many desirable qualities. Clearly had man in mind. So now, what does He mean by designed here? And what does the young Earth creationists mean when they say design? Does that mean that during the 6 days, on the day that plants were created, and God spoke, I just snapped my fingers, but it really more broadly, God spoke them into existence and said, "Let there be"? Was there all of a sudden cotton there? And when He did that, was God in His mind thinking, "I'm making this with traits and characteristics that are for man. Like, this is the reason I'm making this particular plant," versus a whole bunch of other similar plants that I'm going to show you that don't really make a product that we have yet figured out anything to do with. All right. So this plant has purpose for man. Other plants, they do something else. Or is design the idea of a process? All right. Is God using a process in designing and sculpting that? And maybe part of that process involves us, right? Because maybe cotton wasn't exactly that useful originally, and we have made it useful to us. So maybe the design in this case is God designed elements in this particular plant that could be used through our own creativity to be an advantage to us. All right, that'd be a little more sophisticated way, I think, of understanding design. And I happen to think that's probably what He thinks. But now I'm going to try to show you that there is some problem even with that particular idea or concept of design. I think many people who've never thought about this before and would just read this article, maybe just thinking like, "Oh yeah, well, I mean, cotton, God made cotton and He just made it. He spoke it into existence and there was cotton, and thank you very much for making that, because we really appreciate it. It makes great clothes for us and a bunch of other products." So he goes on and on and on. Well, not on and on and on. This is a very short article. It's a fluff piece. It's really just to say, like, here's some incredible properties of cotton. We use it for so many different things. Isn't it amazing? And because it's so amazing, clearly God made it, and He made it for us, right? How else could it be made? But then he goes on to point out things like, well, there are drawbacks, right? It takes extensive labor to get them. And yes, it's really hard to harvest cotton. And before we had machines that helped us do that, is a very difficult process to do that. And so, was that a good design then? Was cotton like the best design possible? Well, clearly we've made cotton a little bit better, because like the large amount of cotton that it produces now was not originally produced, right? Before man started to manipulate cotton, it only made a small amount of cotton, and it took a lot more work, and it hurt your fingers to open it up. And it still does hurt your fingers to open it up if you manually try to harvest this stuff. And you say, well, why didn't God just design it to be a lot easier to get? If He was thinking of man when He made it, it's like, well, how will man find this most useful? He could have made it not to have those hard bracts and just like open up and you just go in and just like grab it out. And he was like, thank you very much. Now, I think maybe the response to that by answers in Genesis or other creationists might be like, yeah, but remember, you forgot. Here's that sin thing, right? Adam and Eve sinned, and then God cursed, right, the whole creation. And I don't agree with that in particular interpretation of what that means to curse the ground. But nonetheless, they would say, curse the ground. Well, everything is cursed. Everything is falling apart. Everything isn't what it used to be. So maybe cotton originally was like just sitting there, like making cotton for us. And it was easy to get and easy to separate the seeds out of it. And everything was all wonderful. And there wasn't any hard work involved and any pain involved. And then because of sin, all of a sudden, the plants got back at us, right? They became hard and gnarly, and they didn't want to give up as much cotton, and it made it more difficult for us to process as their way of getting back. Well, as a way of God's saying, this is going to be really hard. I'm going to make you work for it. Okay. That's one small part of this whole idea of design. So that would mean that originally cotton was designed differently, and what we see today is a broken design, even though it's still so good and does all these different things. What does He mean by cotton? Okay. God made cotton for us. Well, I want to first remind you, there's a lot of species of cotton. This is just some of them, all right? This is from Wikipedia, some selected species. The arrows here point to cotton species that we have cultivated and turned into types of cotton that we can use for products. And the main one that we use is Gossypium hirsutum, and this is from Central America and the Caribbean, and that's where it's native to. And that is the species that is 90% of the cotton that we make in the world today. So that is grown all over the world. But originally, the cotton that was first cultivated or brought into from the natural world and turned into something that we cultivated, that was more of the Levant type right up here, tree cotton and Levant cotton, all right, from the Arabian Peninsula. And those are a different species, and they produce a little bit different cotton, but nonetheless make similar products out of them. Then there's these other species that no one has ever used to make cotton, but they make a form of cotton. They still make kind of a fibrous thing, but nobody uses it for that. All right, so I don't know, you could say maybe God made those also, but we just, we're not using what God gave us. We can start using designed and he made it for us. You start to then cause people to ask those types of questions about that particular design. So here we have this type of cotton. So I want to also point out, so there's 4 different species of cotton. Well, where did these species come from? Did God make all 4 of those species with different properties, thinking here's things that would be useful to man because they have these different properties, each one of them, that make different kinds of cotton textures and feels? And so that's what he did. So in the original creation, there were at least 4 species and maybe all these other species. But man only decided to use those 4, or it's only figured out how to use those 4, and we're still waiting to figure out how to use the other ones for something. All right, now it gets more interesting. Let's get into the genetics of these particular plants and start talking about, like, if you think about the creation of cotton, how would God have made cotton within a 6-day young earth creationist worldview? Here are different species of cotton, but giving you some other information. This is the size of the genome. So the genome would be all the DNA inside of a single cell. And MBP represents millions of base pairs. So this would be 1.7, this is 700 million, this is 1,700 million base pairs. That's 1.7 billion base pairs. You and I have genomes that are 3.3 billion or 3 billion base pairs. And so you see there's quite a variety, 2.5 billion to 1.3 billion. So there's a species of cotton that has half the amount of DNA as another one, but they're both still diploids. Diploids means you have 2 copies of your chromosomes, like you and I are diploids. We have 46 chromosomes. I believe they have 26 chromosomes in all the diploid versions. And so here's a diploid species with 1.7, and here's a diploid species. There's 13 or 14 species that have around 885 million base pairs of DNA. Now, what's fascinating about this is that the species that we've been talking about that are cultivated, or at least a couple of them, here is our cultivated version right here, right? This one's also cultivated. And then there are the other ones. Here's one that's cultivated. Oh, and here's the other one right here. All right. So these 2 are the ones from more from Africa, or the old world. So these would be the original ones that got cultivated. What's interesting about these particular species up here is that they have what's called the A and the D genome. They are tetraploids, meaning they have 4 copies of their chromosomes instead of 2. And extensive study, because lots of people are interested in cotton, right? So lots of work has been done on the genomes and on the DNA. They have found that the origin of all these different species here, including that Darwinii, the one from the Galapagos Islands, which is pretty close to the one from South America, all of these species appear to be the combination of this particular species and this particular species, which appear to have combined as a hybrid, right? So 2 different species integrated with each other, produced an offspring, but that offspring then had a mutation where it doubled all of its chromosomes and formed an allotetraploid, which means it has 4 copies of all of its chromosomes, which is why it's 2.4 billion base pairs in size. Now, guess what? One of the reasons that you and I are wearing clothes that came from this particular plant is that that particular genome is twice the size and has 4 copies of all its genes instead of 2, compared to all these other species. And that one produces much more cotton, and actually this one also produces more cotton than its relatives that only have 2 copies of their chromosomes. That often happens with cultivated plants when they become polyploids, double their genomes. They also get larger in size, like your pumpkins and your squashes and all this. A lot of your mega large ones are polyploids. But this is thought to be a natural event, not caused by us doing it. And so this happened in nature. These two combined, formed this, sometime formed a polyploid. That polyploid then diversified into a number of different species, each of which has different numbers of different sized genomes now, just like all these species have different sized genomes. Now, what does all this have to do with, me talking about creationism and origins and answers in Genesis? Now, if we ask the further question, okay, so what exactly did God make? If you're talking about like God made cotton, right? He designed cotton. So what does it mean when you say God designed cotton? Does it mean that God made every single one of these species? All right, 6,000 years ago. All right, all of these different species, each of which has its own genome with its own characteristics. Some of these have different genes than other ones have in it. Did he create every single one of those just like they are today? All right, so there was, he created all of them. They all exist, and then they've all been copying themselves from then on. If that were the case, then why does it look like these species are the combination of the genomes of these? See, what they've done is they've sequenced the genome of this one and the genome of this one, actually the genome of a bunch of these. And these 2 genomes look like they're the chromosomes that are part of the 4 chromosomes that are in all of these, right? So that's where they get the idea that, hey, these 2 combined doubled, and now you have 4 copies in all of those. But if God created all of these as individual creations, then you'd have to argue that this is some kind of appearance of evolution, right? Appearance of change, or we'll say appearance of design over time. The design being the design to have 2 plants join each other, double their chromosomes, change their genes, turn genes off and on, and so forth. And so it doesn't really make sense to say that God created every one of these individually, because then you're going to have to say that God created all the appearance of a history for all of these, right? They appear to be related to each other somehow by ancestors, and those ancestors seem to have histories that we can actually interpret and infer from their genome data and the genes that they have. So what's the other possibility? Now, I really don't think that any young Earth creationists today, at least modern ones in the main organizations, would tell you that God created all these different species. If he didn't create all these individual species separately, right, at one time, sometime 6,000 years ago, then what exactly did he make? And so here's where I think some creationists would say God made something like this ancestor to all the cotton, right? He made a cottony-like plant that had lots of genetic potential, right? It was lots of heterozygosity and stuff, meaning lots of genetic variation in it. That variation then, as the plant began to reproduce, sorted out the variation, and eventually it sorted into a bunch of different varieties of cotton that we call species. And some of them lost genes, and some of them gained parts, and some of them like doubled some other material, so they got much larger genomes. Other ones had smaller genomes. And then there was 2 main groups of ones that developed, lots of different species that are really similar to each other. That's what these short branch lengths represent. And then maybe one of those descendants of the original cotton that God produced that was there, like Adam and Eve would have saw something cotton-like plant, which we don't really know exactly what the features were, but would have had similar features to some of the cotton today, kind of an amalgam of all these. And two of those specific descendants might have gotten together and had a hybridization event, which then created a new species, which then doubled its chromosomes, and then it speciated again. Like some of them managed to get their way all the way to the Galapagos Islands, and when they got there, they then were under different conditions, and they developed into this species we call Gossypium darwinii. All right, and by the way, all of these are in the New World. Right. So maybe this event happened and then they traveled to the New World and then they started a whole bunch of species there. Wow. Okay. Now, I would say that's a whole bunch of evolution. All right. There's no other way to slice that. That is a lot of evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biologists think that this process probably took about 10 million years, all right, to occur, to be able to develop all these different strains and lineages of cotton. And these different cotton characteristics. Okay, so now we have some choices here. God made a cotton ancestor that then evolved or changed into all the different varieties of cotton. Still haven't figured out where you're going to fit the flood in here, right? Did the flood kill off a bunch of species? Did all these species arrive after the flood? The thing is this particular species right here was cultivated very early on, according to that article, right after the flood. You know, the cotton was in this article that I didn't show you all of. He talks about cotton being cultivated in the New World, the Old World, sort of like really early, like right after the flood. Well, that would mean all these species had to exist already right after the flood. So how did that happen? Where did they come from? How did they speciate so fast? That's where you get this idea of hyperspeciation. All of a sudden, it's just like, boom, they just turned into a bunch of different species. How'd they end up in the different parts of the world they're in? The questions could go on and on and on and on, but I am going to make it a little more difficult, right? Because cotton all looks pretty similar to each other, and somebody could say, yeah, those cottons are all real similar. I could see how they could just be like variations, kind of like different dog breeds came from wolves, all right? Those are all just different breeds of dogs. All right, let's look at the bigger family. Like cotton is not just by itself. Cotton is a genus, Gossypium, but there are 244 other genera in the Malvaceae family, and the Malvaceae family has a whole bunch of different kinds of plants that I know these flowers don't look exactly the same. They certainly aren't, but they have a lot of similar characteristics, and the rest of the plant has similar characteristics. But each of these groups have their own unique characteristics. So over here we have the Malvoideae, and in the Malvoideae are several different families, several different genera that include hibiscus, which I showed you a picture of, and cotton, among a bunch of others, right? There's a bunch of different genera there. And then there's all bunch of other genera here. Over here, I'm gonna say something later about this. This is the group that coffee is found in. Sorry, not coffee. Sorry, chocolate. All right, cacao is also in the Malvaceae family. So here's the Malvaceae family, and again, 244 genera in this one family, over 4,000 species of plants. It includes things like okra, you've got your cotton, and then as I was just saying, you've got your chocolate. And very quick botany lesson here. This is called the floral formula. In other words, how could you sum up the whole family? What do they have in common with each other? Well, they have a similar floral structure. They have other vegetative characters that are similar to each other too. That's the reason why they're all put together in this one big family unit. They are bisexual plants, right? Meaning they have male and female parts in the same plant. They have a calyx, which is the outer whorl, which has 5 parts. And then they have 5 petals. That's the corolla. So you have 5 parts in your corolla. They all have that. The corolla is fused to, that's what this means, it is fused to the andrecium. The andrecium are the male parts, and they always have lots of male parts. So uncountable, right? Here's the male part. You wouldn't go counting those, right? So that's why the infinity sign. And then they have in the center of the flower the gynecium, which is the female structure, and there are either 2 ovaries or up to uncountable number of ovaries. That's true for hibiscus and for Gossypium. Yeah, actually, I'm not actually sure about Gossypium. Can't remember if it has two or whether it has more than two. Anyway, here's a cross section of hibiscus, which is a different genus, and Gossypium, which is the cotton. So now here's where it gets interesting, right? I'm saying that there's this huge family that has 4,000 species, 244 genera. Now you might say, okay, all the cottons are all derived, like God made an original type of cotton and then allowed that cotton to then diversify across the world into 20 or 30 different species of cotton. And so he made that one kind. But then there is hibiscus, which now I'm showing you. Hibiscus is really similar, and you can understand why the two are thought to be in the same family, and they're even in the same subfamily. Maybe they have a common ancestor. I mean, did God make something that was the ancestor to both of them? In which case, he didn't actually create cotton directly, right? He created the ancestor to the two, but this doesn't make cotton in terms of the product cotton. And maybe its ancestor didn't make cotton. In fact, I would argue it almost definitely didn't, because if you look at the other 10 different subfamilies here or genera inside the Malvoideae, only cotton makes what you think of as being cotton as a useful product. All the rest have similar seeds, similar fruits, all this stuff, but they don't make that cotton fiber at all, which suggests that that's not the normal feature of this particular group, and none of these other plants do, these other 3,000. So you're left with, okay, well, this could be related to this, but that might also be related to mallow plants, which if I showed you a picture of a mallow plant, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And so you might say, oh, well, they're also the same thing, and they have a common origin. Well, now you don't really even have cotton being made in the original creation. It kind of came along later. If this is the original ancestor to cotton, maybe God didn't make that ancestor. Maybe God made the ancestor to that, which then through genetic filtering and sorting ended up in some ancestor, then made some kind of fibers. And then those things then diversified in all these groups, which some of these don't really make very good fibers at all. And so they're not cotton that you would use to make clothes. So I guess God didn't design those species for man. He only designed, these 4 different species for man, because they're the only ones that are actually useful to us. Now, you might wonder, well, what do young Earth creationists think about the origins of this? I mean, John Upchurch he's just like, God designed these, right, for us, right? He designed cotton for us, as if cotton was just, it existed. God made cotton the way it is. I don't think that most young Earth creationists actually, if you really drill down and force them to answer the question, did God, if Adam or Eve there and he walked over the whole earth, would they have seen something that looked just like cotton, and could they have used it as cotton? You're like, probably not, because we actually believe that all the Malvaceae is one big family, maybe one big kind. And so he just created a blueprint for all of these different types of genera, of which only one of them is the one that makes this cotton thing. Another one makes okra. Another one makes chocolate. And wouldn't you say that God also made or designed chocolate for us as well? I mean, if God designed cotton for us, surely he designed chocolate for us as well. I don't know about okra. Not a big fan of the okra. But some people would say God absolutely made okra for us because it's the best thing ever, right? And he must have designed it for us. Now the story is complex, because what you're saying is that all these things, plus dozens of other things that we use, all of those are actually linked together by a commonly designed ancestor, which was none of these things specifically, but then was designed to become all these things over time. Well, now you're talking about design being not, I designed it. Design is a process. Design is something that is like, we're going to change over time. And as we change over time, we're going to develop characteristics that then can be manipulated by man. And man is involved in that design in a way, right? Because they're like, oh, I like that character. I think I can use that characteristic for something. And then we do our own matings and we kind of manipulate and shape that organism even more to produce a larger amount of cotton. But nonetheless, maybe the original plant didn't produce a cotton that we'd recognize at all, and we had to wait till later in time. In other words, when God created, so here's how you have to view design from the creationist standpoint. God is making man in a perfect creation where everything was perfect, right? And there wasn't any need for cotton because he didn't need clothes, right? And I mean, God made the first clothes for them anyway. So God made cotton immediately in the creation. He had them in mind. Well, when you say he had them in mind, you'd have to think, oh, God knew that he was going to fall. God knew that the creation is going to be corrupted. God knew that there was going to be difficulty making different things. And so therefore he provided him with this plant that wasn't originally cotton in the sense that they were going to need originally. So it didn't make cotton originally, but it had the instruction set in it that could be manipulated over time through natural selection and mutations and other things that God was guiding or maybe not guiding, depending on creationist view of that, of how God actually works in the world immediately right now. And then eventually becomes cotton that a man says, I think I can do something with that. And then he takes sort of over the creative process and pulls out that thing that God kind of got started. You see how that's a much more difficult idea of what design is than simply writing an article that says, cotton is amazing. It does amazing things for us. God obviously thought of us and made cotton for us. The average reader is going to read that and think, oh, God made a cotton plant when they see a cotton plant. It is like he made it. They're not going to think that made means a long process of change. And saying that is not really that different than saying 6,000 years, how about 6 million years? I mean, that's still making it, right? That's still designing it in really the same way he's designing over 6,000 years. That's not that different of a thing. So creationists are confused. What's a better word? They're inconsistent, partly because they haven't really thought through the things I've just been talking about. So here's an article on the evolution of chocolate. And in this article, they certainly make it sound like they believe that cacao was made by God. It was designed by God. I don't have that quote in there. So God made cacao, chocolate, for us. It wasn't, they're very critical of the evolutionists suggesting that chocolate evolved from some other plants, right? And so no, I mean, chocolate's this wonderful thing, and God must have had us in mind when he made chocolate for us to find. The problem with chocolate, of course, is it's in the same family. All right, it's in the Malvaceae. And yeah, I know this flower doesn't look a whole lot like the flowers I showed you before, but if you look at anatomically, if you look at the floral formula, 5-5 androecium, and having 5 anthers and 5 stamens. I'm sorry, 5 carpels, female parts. It's very similar and fits into the other plants, plus a lot of other vegetative features and the chemistry of the plants themselves. They have a lot of similar chemistry to them, places them in the same family, the Malvaceae. And do some creationists believe that the Malvaceae is all one kind? Yep, they do. All right, so here's Todd Elder. Now, he's by no means a mainstream creationist, but he's huge into Baraminology, basically creationist taxonomy, in which he has trying to figure out what are all the different kinds that God made, all right? What are all the different baramins, sorts of kinds that are part of God's original creation? And so he has this whole big paper on angiosperms, which are flowering plants, and he's going to delineate all the different holobaramin. Holobaramin would be the original kinds that God created. And then on one page, he has he has something called the Malvabar, right? Well, that's the Malvaceae, but with a different Latin-y sounding name on the end that is a baramin type of thing. And so he calls that the mallow family or the mallow baramin. And in the mallow baramin, he has 75 genera. I said 244. He's excluding a couple of them, but he does have the hibiscus and gossypium, which he changes the name of, being in the same kind, right? So not created separately from one another as separate kinds. And then if you look a little further in the stuff, there's also, cacao and other things. So in other words, here's a creationist saying these are all the same kind. Well, if they're all the same kind, well, then they're all actually related to one another. Now, there is one way around this, and Robert Carter from creation.com has found, I think, a partial way of getting around this. And he's just finished up a series. Actually, I don't know if he's finished, but he's published part 3 of Species Were Designed to Change, all right, which is kind of what I've been talking about. If God created things that were designed to change, then they could change into the designs that we see today, but that's not actually the original design. What you're looking at is not the original form of those things. That's what they would say. And so he has different patterns of the way diversity could have changed over time. And one of his is called the type 3A Baraminology. And this is where he envisions that there may be a kind of organism, a kind created, but that kind might have been created as like different, like maybe 3 different genera, like 3 different sorts of things that look different from each other, but they're not a different kind. They're all part of the same kind. The reason they're part of the same kind is because they can hybridize with each other to produce variations and themes. So it's sort of like saying God created wolves and coyotes at the same time, and those are one kind, but he created variation in that kind, different species within that kind. Those species could then intermingle with each other to form groups of the same thing, fuse together, or they can continue to divide. Well, here he's saying, he's looking at animals in this case, in which case he has to explain how all the vertebrate organisms might have started out with many different varieties, and then, but only the flood eliminated all of them except 2, but then those 2 became different varieties after the flood. Well, the same thing you do with plants. You could say that God created cacao and maybe some kind of gossypium, all right, cotton, separately from each other, but in the same kind. And so they were allowed to intermingle with each other over time. Now, there's really no biological evidence for that. And certainly the way we look at these genomes suggests that they are related to one another by a common ancestor versus multiple ancestors that then have somehow maybe gotten together or unified, or that they're completely compatible with each other, because most of these members are not compatible with each other at all today, which in most creationist definitions would mean they're in different kinds because they're not compatible. They can't form hybrids with each other. But that all gets quite complex. All right, so let's get back to our gossypium here. So when you say that God clearly had man in mind when he created this plant, well, I can't even say this particular plant because this plant isn't a cultivated plant. So what did God have in mind when he created Gossypium darwinii? Well, I think everybody agrees that Gossypium darwinii is just a speciated offshoot and off branch of another form of cotton that got to the Galapagos Islands and has changed into the color patterns and the forms that it has today. And so in that sense, God has designed that particular plant for that place. But how has he designed it for that particular place? He's designed it in the sense that he has designed it to be able to distribute itself. All right. So the plant is designed to be able to disperse. And when it disperses, it then grows. And then if it grows in a new habitat, it has variation, and natural selection will select on that variation, which then changes the characteristics of the next generation. There are mutations that occur that might change the flower color, or maybe change the amount of fibers that it produces, or when they produce. And those then get selected again, whether they're selected out or selected for in that population. And that population changes over time. And you end up with different variations or different species of cotton. And so in that case, design means the mechanisms of how we understand organisms change, or how we've understood organisms to change in our scientific understanding of it. How far back would you have to go to find the actual plant that God created? All right, if you're a de novo creationist, that's where it gets interesting. You know, it's pretty easy for creationists to say, like, this plant is related to that other plant over there, and that other cotton, and that other cotton, and that other cotton, and maybe they could make that same tree and even come up with how they got different sized genomes and these genes got shifted around here. That's a huge amount of change. And again, like I said, evolutionists would call that evolution by evolutionary processes. But then when you start linking this particular genus to other genera that have different characteristics, and then they are linked to other genera that have different characteristics, then you start to get into like, well, what then the original plant look like that God created? And how could you say that God created that for man when most of the products that were developed from that particular original species really aren't useful for man, right? Only some small fraction or piece of the variation was actually for man. All right, let's leave it there. Hey, come find my stuff on thenaturalhistorian.com or subscribe to this particular channel, and maybe I'll tell some more crazy stories about plants and creationists. Thanks.